for the actual cost certification, we typically start anywhere between 50 to 75% of construction completion. We can, perform the bulk of our testing on the closing costs as well as construction costs incurred to date, which can really help, minimize work on the back end and, speed up the turnaround time after the final costs have been incurred.
Welcome to BuzzHouse, a Baker Tilly podcast where you can find all the buzz around multifamily housing. I'm Don Bernards, the partner in charge of Baker Tilly's multifamily housing practice.
And I'm Garrick Gibson, a partner at Baker Tilly, also specializing in consulting on multifamily housing transactions across the country.
Each week, we'll bring you a guest or a topic in the multifamily housing industry that will help you win now and anticipate tomorrow. Let's get started. We are very excited to welcome into the BuzzHouse today our colleague here at Baker Tilly, Jeff Blattner, a partner of ours who spends his time in the real estate and construction sectors. Jeff is joining us today to let us know what are some key considerations and things to remember around your cost certifications for low-income housing tax credit projects. Before jumping in with Jeff, we have a few updates from around the industry. The big news around the affordable housing industry was the White House announcing a new housing supply action plan to increase the supply of affordable housing over the next 5 years. The plan includes both legislative and administrative actions to address the shortage of affordable housing, building off the administration's announcement last September on immediate steps to increase the supply of affordable housing, and of course the House passed Build Back Better reconciliation proposal. Specifically, the plan calls for financing of more than 800,000 additional affordable rental units by expanding the housing credit and pressing Congress to pass the provisions in the House passed, again, reconciliation legislation, which of course included the big topic that Garrick and I have talked about a number of times, lowering the bond financing threshold from 50% to 25% to, of course, allow more deals to access tax and bonds and 4% credits, increasing the annual housing credit allocation for 9% projects, and providing basis boosts for properties serving extremely low income households and Native American communities. The administration also reiterates its proposal in the president's fiscal year 2023 budget to allow housing credit allocating agencies, or the HFAs, to provide a 30% basis boost, really discretionary to 4% bond finance properties. A couple other minor items. The plan also notes that the administration will pursue unilaterally a pledge from the IRS to finally get out the average income test. Many of you know as income averaging. Garrick and I have talked about that as well, and just to kind of effectively a freeze on projects utilizing income averaging right now. And then also asking and urging Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac to continue to grow their equity investments in the capital. Of course, with the deadline to pass reconciliation legislation approaching and midterm elections also nearing, the window is kind of getting very narrow for these proposals to get approval. So we'll kind of keep our eyes on that as we move forward. Just one other thing of note that we want to let our listeners know about is the National Council of State Housing Agencies, or of course NCSHA, announces awarded grants to 6 state housing agencies to develop strategic partnerships with hospitals and health organizations to finance affordable housing. Many of you, of course, know health is housing and so forth. Quality housing is a social determinant of health. So really the grants are the foundation of the NCSHA sponsored Healthy Housing, Healthy Communities Partnerships Initiative, which aims to leverage the state HFA's role at the center of the affordable housing system to attract significant health institution involvement and elevate community level leadership in addressing the worsening housing affordability crisis in America. The 6 states that receive these grants are Colorado, Illinois, Nebraska, Pennsylvania, Rhode Island, and the state of Washington. And we're very excited that this kind of late summer, we'll have Tracy Kaufman with NCSHA on our podcast to discuss how the rollout of these grants is going. Now excited to jump into our discussion with Jeff. I can turn it over to Garrick.
Thanks, Don, and really excited to have Tracy Kaufman on, and congratulations to those finance authorities who won those awards. So, Jeff, thanks for being on the BuzzHouse podcast. Before we get into some questions, we usually like to start by letting our listeners have a little background of who our guests are. So, go ahead and just discuss your role with Baker Tilly and what types of projects and clients that you work with.
Yeah, thanks, Don and Garrick, for having me. I'm a partner on our real estate and construction team. I focus a lot of my time on affordable housing projects, in particular light tech and historic tax credit deals, as well as other HUD projects. My role on these projects is primarily issuing cost certifications and other related reports, as well as financial statement audits.
Perfect. So, in the context of cost certifications, which is usually one of the most important steps before submissions to get your 8609s, what are some of the best practices that you're seeing regarding timing? Like, when would you like to start on that engagement, and what works well to be efficient from your end?
Yeah, ideally, we'd like to be involved as early as possible, even prior to construction. Try to identify any potential issues early. For the actual cost certification, we typically start anywhere between 50 to 75% of construction completion. We can, perform the bulk of our testing on the closing costs as well as construction costs incurred to date, which can really help, minimize work on the back end and, speed up the turnaround time after the final costs have been incurred.
Thanks for that. So, I mean, even just moving forward from that idea, right? Because obviously going back and forth, I know you said you like to start at 75%, but I know a lot of it's dictated by the types of information that you're receiving, and how well that information is put together. So, what are some key items or documents that, as the auditor performing this, that you wish you had that you typically don't receive? And, what kind of schedules would those represent?
Yeah, for the most part, our clients do have good records. It starts with having a really well organized draw schedule, costs broken out into good categories, and underlying invoices for each of the items. Some things we don't always get would include an appraisal that breaks out the value of land versus building on an acquisition rehab deal. This is especially important as land doesn't qualify for eligible basis, so an allocation of that purchase price is necessary. An appraisal that specifically breaks that out is typically very helpful. Also, at times there are costs that are paid out of operations or maybe are accrued and not paid at the time the cost cert is done. So a nice schedule of those types of costs is very helpful. Without that, it's very easy for these types of things to be missed.
So, assuming you don't get an appraisal, usually what are you having to do in that instance?
In that case, we need to get our valuation experts involved and help determine an allocation of that cost, evaluate the overall value of the property, and allocate that between land and building.
And would we still do something like that? Let's say if we do get an appraisal, but it's how new does it have to be in order
We
before us to do that analysis?
we would still do that even with an appraisal, but having that appraisal really makes the process a lot easier and cleaner on our end.
Perfect.
Jeff, obviously looking at a lot of information, you got obviously construction costs are probably, 75% of these project costs. Maybe it's acquisition, maybe obviously acquisition's a bigger piece. What are some of the key, line items in the development budget do you tend to focus on? What are, I don't call them risk areas, but areas where you got to really look and especially when you're looking at, eligible, I know one part of your job is to just, kind of make sure the cost exists, but the other part is kind of looking at eligible basis. What are some of those areas you really kind of focus on, on the eligible basis?
Yep, yeah, we focus a lot on the areas there may be more gray areas or things that need to be allocated between different categories. For instance, like I just said, land versus building is something that we spend a lot of time on. Also, if the project has commercial space or other ineligible things like tenant paid amenities, parking, storage, laundry, things of that nature, an allocation of construction costs related to those items is required. So that's something we look at very closely. So, planning up front, coming up with an allocation methodology or even discussion with the contractor to have them break out those costs specifically on the pay application can really make the process a lot smoother on the back end. We also focus on things like allocation of legal, professional, loan fees, things like that between construction loan, perm loan, or cost syndication, eligible and ineligible costs. That's something we spend a lot of time on. Also on deals, rehab deals with tenants in place during construction. We look at soft costs like interest, taxes, insurance, and evaluate how much can be included in basis versus expensed. There are different methodologies and elections that can be made on the tax return that can impact the amount that's ultimately included in eligible basis.
Perfect. Jeff, I know we talk a lot about, sometimes there, we talked a lot about here about cost certifications. We know there's many of these other tests, and some are kind of cliff tests, right? If you don't pass it or it's required. What are some of those tests that you also work on? I know I'll just start with, I know the 10% test is something that a lot of times comes up, and people kind of lose sight of it as well.
Yep, the 10% test for 9% light tech deals is important. It's good to understand the requirements in each state that you're working in because they do differ. So it's good to understand that upfront. On 4% bond deals, there's a 50% test calculation that's required. So that's something not to lose sight on. Sometimes it's included in the cost certification itself. Sometimes it's a separate report. Projects with solar credits need to be evaluated because there could be a reduction in basis for the solar credit. So there could be a report there for that calculation as well.
Yeah, thanks, Jeff. Before we kind of wrap it up, because this is all good information, I presume too, if you're combining it with historics, it'd be similar to the solar and on the reduction of basis. So what about stories? Just to give some context to some of our listeners, are there any kind of lessons learned? Regarding when you're during these cost certs, regarding maybe timing or how people are trying to incur cost and maybe give some instances where certain people had certain assumptions that didn't quite play out.
Yeah, lately we've been seeing some issues with construction delays, not surprisingly with everything going on, which has delayed, placed in service dates. So it's really important to make sure the costs are all incurred by the end of the calendar year in which tax credits are first claimed. So we've seen instances recently where costs have been deferred into a subsequent year, which has really created some issues with eligible basis. So there are some strategies to potentially minimize that impact, but it's important to identify that issue early, in particular before year end, to understand the impact and see if there's anything we can do to help.
Jeff, really, really appreciate you joining us today in the Buzz House. And listeners, thank you for tuning in today as well. Thank you for listening to Buzz House. To receive a notification when new episodes are available, please subscribe to Buzz House, a Baker Tilly podcast, wherever you get your podcasts. For additional resources around multifamily housing, check out bakertilly.com. And if you have a suggested topic, please send them to build@bakertilly.com. That's BUILD@bakertilly.com.